Since early 2022, Europe's been hit by what you can only call an economic earthquake. It's an incredible story of rattled energy markets, inflation that went through the roof, and a whole continent being forced to completely rethink its future. And it was all triggered by one single event. To really get how deep this shockwave goes, we've got to look at where Europe was standing right before the ground started to shake.
To really wrap your head around the scale of this shock, it all starts right here. Look at this. Before the war, Europe was playing this super high-stakes energy game. A staggering 40% of its natural gas and 30% of its oil was coming directly from Russia. Now, this wasn't just some number on a chart. This was the very bedrock of its entire industrial and domestic power.
And this gamble, this incredibly deep dependence, it wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate choice. For decades, you had major economies like Germany and Italy building up their industrial power on the back of cheap Russian energy. They saw it as a calculated risk, one that would keep them competitive. Well, that long-held belief was about to have some pretty massive consequences.
And then, February 2022, that long-simmering risk just erupted into a full-blown crisis. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine didn't just kick off a war. It triggered an economic shockwave that would spare no corner of the continent. Everything was about to change.
And things happened so fast. The invasion was met almost immediately with these incredibly severe sanctions from the West. And then, in retaliation, Russia basically turned off the taps. They weaponized the very energy supplies that Europe had relied on for so long. The dominoes were starting to fall, and they were falling fast.
So you gotta understand, this wasn't just an energy crisis anymore. Nope, it very quickly morphed into an everything crisis. The shockwave just refused to stay contained in the energy markets. It spilled over, reaching into every business, every single home, and every wallet right across the continent. The first, and honestly, the most powerful impact was on prices. Natural gas costs didn't just go up, they absolutely exploded, increasing by 4, even 5 times what they were before the war. Can you imagine your electricity bills suddenly doubling or even tripling? For industries that use a ton of energy, like steel and chemicals, this was basically a potential death blow.
So what happens when energy costs explode like that? Well, this happens. Record inflation. Across a ton of European countries, inflation shot past 8%. That's a level that most people hadn't seen in their entire lifetimes. All of a sudden, the basic cost of just living was skyrocketing.
And this set off this really painful two-front crisis. On one side, you had entire industries facing shutdowns and job losses. But on the other side, you had households battling higher bills for fuel, for food, and watching their savings just get wiped out. The pain was being felt everywhere, from the factory floor all the way to the family dinner table.
And yeah, the pressure at the dinner table didn't stop with energy bills. The war totally disrupted exports from Ukraine and Russia. We're talking 2 of the world's biggest bread baskets here. With all their shipments of wheat and sunflower oil choked off, the price of basics like bread and cooking oil just shot through the roof, adding a whole other layer of strain on families.
But, a crisis like this, it forces you to change. It just does. Europe was backed into a corner. Its whole economic model was under threat. So it was forced to make this massive, historic pivot. Faced with the biggest shock in a generation, the entire continent started to rewrite its own future, right there in real time.
So the big question is, right? How exactly do you respond to that? How do you replace nearly half of your energy supply and deal with a massive cost of living crisis, all at the same time? Well, the answer was this sweeping 3-pronged strategy. First up, an all-out sprint to find new suppliers, importing huge amounts of liquefied natural gas from places like the US and Qatar. Second, they hit the accelerator on renewables, pouring just unbelievable amounts of money into wind and solar. And third, they had to use some painful but totally necessary stopgap measures, even restarting old coal and nuclear plants just to keep the lights on.
And this pivot, it was so much bigger than just energy. Governments started spending billions on subsidies to try and shield people and businesses, which of course made public debt grow. But maybe the most profound shift was how the crisis completely reordered Europe's whole identity when it comes to security. Germany, for example, announced a Zeitenwende, a historic turning point, totally overhauling decades of military policy with a massive increase in defense spending. It was a fundamental change in Europe's entire worldview.
Okay, so after all that chaos, all that change, where does all this leave Europe today? Well, the economic map of the continent has basically been redrawn. And the new landscape is one defined by both enormous challenges and, yeah, the very first signs of progress.
And look, let's be real here. There is no sugarcoating the immediate pain. The combo of that high inflation and the sharp interest rate hikes needed to fight it, well, it caused economic growth to slow to a crawl. Some countries even tipped into recession, just struggling under the sheer weight of it all. So what you have here is this classic, really tough trade-off. The short-term pain is just undeniable. You've got continued economic pressure and a slow, really difficult recovery. But the potential long-term gain is just as significant. Way stronger energy security, a break from a really dangerous dependency, and a powerful push toward a greener, more diverse economy.
There's a quote that I think just nails it. Europe is paying a high price today to gain strategic independence tomorrow. And that really gets to the heart of what's happening. It's an entire continent sacrificing comfort right now for resilience and freedom down the road. Which leaves us, really, with the ultimate question. After all the pain, after all the pivoting, is Europe going to emerge from this crisis weaker, maybe permanently scarred by this whole economic shock, or will it come out of it stronger, more resilient, having been forced to build a whole new path out of sheer necessity? The answer to that question is going to define the continent for decades to come.